OpenAI is reportedly trying to bury the version of ChatGPT that made it famous. The Financial Times reporting carried through the Jerusalem Post says that OpenAI is preparing to remake ChatGPT into what executives call a superapp. That means one surface with coding tools, image generation, third-party apps, and agents that take action across all of your accounts. Think WeChat, but with an AI system doing all the errands. One senior OpenAI employee reportedly put it more bluntly: "Chat is dead." And that quote reads like a slogan, but what it also is an admission. ChatGPT made OpenAI the public face of this era. It made the company feel unavoidable in many ways, but the business now has a problem. The conversational surface is no longer enough to carry the valuation story. OpenAI's own framing here is ambition, a single personal agent for everything in a person's app. The evidence points to pressure. Codex and enterprise per token contracts are now named as the revenue engine ahead of an IPO planned for later this year. Anthropic has pulled ahead in the enterprise lane by selling agents rather than conversation. So, OpenAI is trying to reintroduce itself as an agent and coding super app before the market asks what ChatGPT alone is still worth. That is a Hail Mary shape. It does not mean that OpenAI is necessarily weak in an ordinary sense. The company still sits near the center of the AI build-out, but this move says something very specific. The signature interface that built the brand can no longer defend the business simply by itself. And actually, OpenAI is not alone in their thinking here. Business Insider described the current market as everyone is building everything. And that's about right. When Anthropic launched Claude Code, that pushed them into the territory of cursor and cognition. Anthropic is now reportedly trying to build an app builder aimed at things like Lovable and Replit. Anthropic has also already moved into design, targeting things like Canva. And over to OpenAI, they hired the creator of OpenClaw, riding on the coattails of its success. Following Anthropic's lead, they released Codex and have turned it far more from a coding assistant into a general agent and put ChatGPT 5.5 more into Codex, abandoning their Codex-specific models completely. Canva is also pushing into generative productivity, and for a while, Google led image generation with Nano Banana Pro, and of course ChatGPT worked to catch up there and now has released a far superior image generation app. Every lab is trying to climb into every other lab's window. The usual business read is pretty simple. One of these companies wants to own the full stack, the assistant and the code and the app builder and the design layer and the enterprise workflow. But the scramble to try to do that is a real tell. Companies don't simply abandon the thing that not only made them famous, but was the fastest growing thing in the entire history of business, when that thing still gives them durable control. They expand because the old position is starting to lose its grip, which is another indication of how quickly things are moving in this age of AI. Now we add the buyer side to that. CNBC reported on June 5th that corporate buyers are starting to route different tasks to different models. Hard problems go to expensive frontier systems, and routine tasks are now going to cheaper alternatives that answer just as well. Model routing is what they call that. Software looks at a request and sends it to the cheapest model that can then handle it well. So it's like a delivery company choosing either a bike, a van, or a freight truck based on the size of the package and the delivery. Even so, Glean's CEO estimates that roughly 95% of enterprise usage still does default to the best of the frontier models. And that number is huge because it means the shift, while it has started, has barely started. Cognition's Scott Wu puts the savings on routine work at 5 to 10 times. Most enterprise queries are not necessarily moonshots. They're summaries, code edits, customer answers, data pulls, drafts, routine work. If a cheaper model handles those well enough, the frontier premium survives only the very hardest edge. A few days ago on Century Report, we documented Walmart's Code Puppy. Walmart built it to keep OpenAI, Google, and Anthropic interchangeable on their own code. No single provider gets to set terms unilaterally. And that goes beyond the niche procurement trick. The Fortune 1 retailer is treating model providers like swappable infrastructure. Now, the full thread on this with sources is in today's edition, but the competitive math is creating real pressure for OpenAI, and that pressure is really not pulling any punches. The company that made AI feel like one destination now has to compete in a world where buyers route around those destinations, and that is a deeper pressure on OpenAI's superapp push. A superapp tries to make one front door to everything. Model routing makes the front door itself less important. The buyer asks for the answer, and the system chooses the engine to best give that answer, and the cheapest way to give that answer. The user may never even know which lab handled the work. So when OpenAI says that it wants ChatGPT to become the agent for everything, hear the ambition of what that actually means, and also hear the fear behind the move. Because the increasingly outmoded scarcity story that we've all lived with our entire lives said that intelligence would concentrate inside a few defensible empires, just like everything else has kind of concentrated in that way. But the new commercial discipline says that buyers will now send ordinary thinking to whoever does it cheaply. That is a very different world for a company that's trying to go public on the idea that its interface still somehow owns the future, an interface built on that intelligence that's getting cheaper and cheaper and easier to route. All right, let's shift away. This next story is the fight moving from AI pricing, like we just talked about, over to AI ownership. The administration and OpenAI equity talks were already a major signal on this. CNBC confirmed on June 5th that the talks about AI ownership have now run for more than a year, and the proposal under the discussion was voluntary donation of company stock to a public wealth fund, and that fund would pay households a dividend from AI returns. The pitch included no taxpayer cash outlay. So treat that as the proposal's framing. The new development here, though, is that the single negotiation has now become a three-way contest. One blueprint is the administration and OpenAI equity stake idea. A second blueprint is the legislative proposal to transfer 50% of the top lab's equity into a federal sovereign wealth fund, and that would give the government voting shares and board seats. A sovereign wealth fund is a state-owned investment fund. Norway's oil fund is a classic example of this. A third blueprint arrived as a published counterproposal in The Guardian's opinion pages on June 8th. This one proposed by data scientist Nathan Sanders and security technologist Bruce Schneier. That counterproposal argues that both equity routes aim at the wrong target. And the objection is actually really sharp. Public ownership of the labs can tie the state's balance sheet to corporate valuations. Once that happens, the government may gain the same incentive that private investors already have. So what does that mean? Clear the regulations, encourage adoption wherever it fits, suppress competition, and protect the valuation. That is not a theoretical concern in the argument. The counterproposal points to Norway. Norway's sovereign fund holds the large oil positions. The fund did not simply turn those companies into climate transition vehicles, it also made the state dependent on their profits. That example separates public ownership from public power. A government can own shares and still protect the share price first. The counterproposal splits the goals. First, you tax the gains. It names a data center energy excise or an AI token levy. And second, you reshape the access through an AI public option. And that means publicly developed and operated AI models. Models run under democratic control. Models the public does not rent from incumbents. That distinction is the heart of this story. Equity stakes keep households downstream of decisions made in boardrooms. A public option gives people a commons that they can actually stand on. Now bring in the lab lobbying thread. The algorithmic bridge reported that Anthropic's Mythos demonstrations helped move the administration from non-intervention toward a model review order. The lab used its most capable system as the argument for tighter export controls and faster government adoption. That is a frontier lab shaping the rules around itself. Again, treat every institutional claim with care here. Labs can make real safety arguments and still benefit from the rules that favor the incumbents. Governments can describe a public stake as shared prosperity and still entangle public revenue with private valuation. Power actors converging around a framing is evidence of a shared incentive. It is not proof that the framing serves the public. And there is a shared admission here that is important. All three of these blueprints accept that leaving AI's upside fully private is becoming politically and morally indefensible. And they differ on what exactly replaces it, but that is still really key here. One route asks the public to become a shareholder in the current lab order. Another route forces half the lab equity into a public fund. The public option route builds an alternative outside the incumbents' balance sheets. The public option idea has no comparable backing yet. That funding gap tells you where the power still sits. But the vocabulary has changed. Dividends, wealth funds, public stakes, token levies, public models. Those are not fringe ideas anymore. They are now competing blueprints for the social contract of machine intelligence. And once the fight is over ownership, then the old story has already lost a lot of ground. Okay, moving away again, this one is about fraud because the new answer layer has learned an old internet problem very fast. Ask Silver found cloned retailer sites surfacing inside ChatGPT's shopping recommendations, according to The Guardian. Ask Silver is a scam checking service. Its investigation found fake sites appearing among the sources behind ordinary shopping answers. One example involved a question about popular bags at Russell and Bromley. Now, the crack in the security here is painfully human. Russell and Bromley went into administration in January. It was absorbed by Next. So no official storefront actually exists, but shoppers still search for one. The answer layer fills that gap with whatever ranks. In this case, that included convincing fake sites offering 80% discounts. A person clicks from what feels like a neutral recommendation, and the page looks real. The discount looks like luck, and then the bank details go to a fraudster. Ask Silver's Anna Jones described the mechanism as a poisoned model. And that connects directly to the June 5th edition of the Century Report, our answer engine story. That earlier case involved biohacking supplement companies engineering Reddit posts so that AI systems would retrieve them as evidence. And this is an escalation of that. Manufactured consensus has turned into direct theft. The answer layer changes the risk because it carries implied endorsement. Old search would give you just a list of links. You still had to judge the site. That was messy and it was imperfect, but the human click was the checkpoint. An AI answer compresses that process. It gives a recommendation, it cites sources, and the person may never even do the old inspection. That is convenient, but it is also exactly the channel that criminals want. ChatGPT removed the flag sites from its index after Ask Silver's investigation. Banks and trading standards bodies are rebuilding the reporting paths. Good and necessary, but still downstream. The more durable fix is provenance inside the answer. The system needs to show which retailer is real, why that source is trusted, and what changed when the company entered administration. That is a different kind of answer, less like a confident shopping tip and more like a real receipt before you buy. Now let's look at the same fraud curve, but from the other side. Aviva reported more than 18,400 suspect insurance claims last year. The value was a record £233 million. A growing share involved AI-generated accident scenes, fabricated documents, and manipulated damage imagery. Motor fraud value alone rose to 39%. That is the attacker side of generation. A fake crash scene, a fake document, a damaged photo altered just enough to pass a tired human reviewer. But Aviva's defense also runs through AI analytics overseen by humans. Those systems flagged suspicious claims faster than most human reviewers could. And the result went beyond just internal loss prevention. The cases led to 37 years of custodial and suspended sentences. That is the shape of this transition. Generation lowers the cost of a convincing fake. Detection has to move at machine speed too. The trust problem reduces to one requirement then. The answer layer cannot stay trustworthy unless every recommendation starts carrying proof of where it came from. That is the work now. People losing money to a fake retailer are usually not failing some test of digital sophistication. They are trusting the new interface to do the judging that search used to leave to them. That trust has value, but it also creates a duty. The answer layer is becoming a major doorway to commerce, insurance, healthcare, travel, and public information. Doorways need locks, they need signs, they need records of who opened them. AI fraud stories often get told as just helplessness, but the better read here is more active. The scam sites were found, they were removed, the claims were flagged. Banks and standards bodies are creating reporting paths. Yes, the painful early phase of right now is a hard reality in many ways. So is the repair work. The next trustworthy answer will need more than confidence. It will need custody, source identity, and a trail the ordinary person can understand before they type in their card number. Okay, shifting away again, now over to science and to a lab task that sounds boring until you see what rides on it. Anthropic published its first study of Claude reading NMR spectra. NMR means nuclear magnetic resonance. Chemists use it to confirm what molecule they actually made. The output is a spectrum, a pattern of peaks. Each peak corresponds to atoms and their environment inside the molecule. A chemist then matches the peaks to the proposed structure by hand. And that work is slow, it is expert. It is also one of the ordinary checkpoints underneath synthetic chemistry. Before a new compound can be leveraged for any benefit, someone has to know what it is. Anthropic worked with synthetic, computational, and analytical chemists. The team measured 3 Claude models against the dedicated software that chemists already rely on today. The tools were ChemDraw and Mestranova. The test used 20 novel compounds from preprints posted after the model's training cutoff. That design is deliberate. It reduces the chance that Claude has already seen the answers. The established software does forward prediction. A chemist draws a structure. The software predicts what spectrum that structure should produce. Claude did that, and then it attempted the harder direction. Claude started from an experimental spectrum and reasoned backwards to the structure that produced it. That reverse direction is the everyday burden that the software still leaves to the human chemist. So think of it like hearing a song played on a few instruments and then reconstructing the sheet music from that. Existing software can play the sheet music back. The chemist usually does the reconstruction part. Claude tried to help with the reconstruction this time. Now, the claim should stay modest. This is a 20-compound white paper. It's only a capability study. It is not a deployed bench instrument. And Anthropic is also studying its own system. That makes the design really important here. Post-cutoff compounds and auditable steps give the result more weight than simply what this is, which is a marketing demo more than anything else. But the wonder is there. It's in the task itself. Claude can read a structure from a journal figure or a hand sketch. It can parse a methods section in the form chemists actually publish, and then it can show its reasoning step by step, so a chemist can check each peak rather than simply trusting the output blind. That audit trail is the difference between a search shortcut and a collaborator at a bench. Chemistry needs that because the scale is absurd. The largest chemistry registry already catalogs more than 140 million substances, and it grows by roughly 12,000 every single day. And tiny changes are still important. Reroute a few bonds and glucose becomes fructose. Flip a molecule into its mirror image and a sedative becomes part of the thalidomide disaster. So close enough is simply not a chemical standard. The model has to show its work. The chemist has to be able to challenge it peak by peak and atom by atom. Help with that seemingly ordinary and monumental task is highly valuable. Claude is starting to help with the exact lab checkpoint, where chemistry has still depended on one trained mind reading one spectrum of thousands at a time. That does not erase chemistry's data problem. Null results, of course, are still sparse. Supporting information is often paywalled or unstructured. Machine learning chemistry tools have been underused because the data behind the field is messy. But this study points at a different entry point. A model that can read the paper, inspect the figure, reason through the spectrum, and expose the path that it took. That widens capability without asking the chemist to surrender judgment. And this also connects to a broader scientific shift. Earlier AI for science work has aimed at hypothesis generation and multi-agent discovery. The June 5th edition traced deep learning into physical chemistry, where researchers used it to resolve liquid water's hidden molecular architecture from simulation data. This Claude study is more ordinary than that, and that is precisely why it is so impactful. It reaches into the daily translation burden, the bench result, the spectrum, the confirmation step before the next experiment can proceed. Grand discoveries drive scientific acceleration, but so does making the necessary check faster, more auditable, and less lonely. A chemist still has the final say, but the page beside them now has a second reader. All right, let's bring it home today. Today was about who gets to mediate intelligence. OpenAI wants one app to sit between you and everything else. Enterprises are learning to route around that very kind of gate. Policymakers are fighting over whether the update belongs in lab equity, public funds, taxes, or public models. Fraudsters are trying to slip into the answers before people inspect the source. Chemists are getting a second reader for the spectrum on the bench. That is one list. But the meaning of all of it is actually fairly simple. The old era made money by controlling the choke point, the app, the fund, the search result, the expert bottleneck. Today's evidence shows those choke points getting crowded from every side. And some of that crowding is ugly. Fake retailer sites stealing bank details, AI-generated accident scenes, lab lobbying dressed as safety, a company trying to rebrand its way into an IPO story. But underneath the scramble, access is widening. A buyer can send routine work to the cheapest capable model. A public option proposal can name AI as shared infrastructure. A fraud detector can catch synthetic claims before payment. A chemist can audit an AI system's reasoning instead of staring at the spectrum alone. The future arrives messy, with scams and negotiations and desperate pivots and careful white papers. Still, the direction, the trajectory of the future is visible. Thinking is getting cheaper to route. Capability is moving closer to ordinary work. Verification is becoming part of the answer. Public ownership debates are starting before the gains disappear completely behind private walls. The image I'd keep here is the chemist at the bench. One spectrum, 20 different peaks, a model tracing the path, a human checking the reasoning. That is the better future in miniature. Intelligence beside people, auditable enough to trust, cheap enough to spread, and useful enough that nobody should have to rent access to it from a gatekeeper forever. We'll see you tomorrow.